Good evening, and thank you all for coming. This panel discussion is in conjunction with the Bowery Gallery's exhibition, Deep Design, a virtual show that can be viewed at www.BoweryGallery.org, as well as on Artsy. The 12 artists in this exhibition engage in a search for a compositional structure generated by the problem of observing nature's complexity and bringing order into their work. Like artists throughout history, they use conceptual devices to communicate the structure they observe to their audience. Abstract or mathematical concepts such as Euclidean geometry, the golden section, and or more recently ideas like chaos theory and fractal order are a means to this end. As useful as such systems are, however, rarely do these artists employ them without a significant measure of intuition. We all sense a force behind the workings of nature, but how did these artists use mathematical abstractions to get at what we all sense? By reaching far down into their process of understanding nature while making their art, each of the participants in this show believes that they can approach truth and therefore beauty. There are three questions that have been prepared for the panelists. And when each has had a chance to answer any or all of these questions, the audience will have an opportunity to make a comment or ask a question. You may use the chat feature of this at any time, or after the panelists have answered their preliminary questions, you may also click on the hand raise icon. The three questions are: what does deep design mean to you? What is the balance between intuition and structural ideas in your painting? Which artists who epitomize the concepts of this show influence you the most? We'll begin with Rita Baragona. Rita?
Thanks, Bob. I will answer questions 1 and 2. Deep design for me is found in parallel connections made across many disciplines. Each seeks to answer questions in its own language. So I believe the search for deep design is in human curiosity and wonder. I am no scientist or poet, but through thinking about and appreciating ideas, I can grow and deepen my vision. In the context of this show, I will focus on how fractal ideas play into my perceptions. Fractals are the math of dynamic living systems that describe change and complexity. They are everywhere and add another dimension to my painting. Interestingly, studies show that even when we stare, our eyes are moving in erratic fractal patterns from one focus to another. So fractals are an integral part of my seeing as well as the seen. Coincidence or deep design? In the ocean paintings, I am looking at impermanence, seen as repetitive events. I paint rhythmic, irregular marks as I look from small dot waves at the horizon to the tumbling waves that fold in on themselves in smaller and smaller self-replicating patterns. I am in a kind of meditative state of heightened awareness. I am enveloped in energy, sounds, and light. I am not painting the ocean to describe it, but to experience it. I do not think, not fractals, composition, or even turbulence. I just paint. Next image, please. In the balance between intuition and structural ideas in painting, I lean more on the side of intuition, but the answer is more complicated than that. We now know that eyes gather sensations, which the mind organizes into coherent images. There is a symbiotic relationship between subjectivity and structural organization. Not only that, other studies show that the mind, we thought only located in the brain, is a complex system that includes many parts of the body, including the heart. Think butterflies in your stomach, or more to the point, the feelings you get when you're looking at a painting you love. Perhaps part of that emergent mind is intuition. In Vivaldi's Summer, I revel in painting ever-changing structures of color, light, and space. Pigment color parallels light color, which moves and jumps and flows, similar to spatial patterns found in music. The space between color masses are delineated by rhythmic leaf, flower, and focal point edges, which are not always found on an object edge, but can be found through eye movement. Notice how the leaves cascade downward like waves. So the composition is similar to that of my ocean paintings. Is this by nature's design? Or did my mind impose a structure that influenced my sensations? I cannot paint without mind-made signs and patterns, but realizing my sensations comes first. Think Matisse. Next image, please. Rhythmic breath is an essence painting for me. That means it happened in one shot, each mark and color space feeling right. Look at how the marks and rhythms balance, energizing the unpainted white paper. Painting nature's turbulence somehow soothes my soul. I look outward to go inward. I'm happy when I paint. I do not suffer. As it turns out, a study about fractals and aesthetic perception found fractal rhythms in landscapes and music activate parts of the brain that quiet emotions. Although knowing scientific ideas justifies my process, the wonderful thing about art is feelings guide that understanding. Each discipline describes some aspect of deep design. There are too many connections between them to be coincidental. Einstein knew an equation was right when it was beautiful. Compositions are beautiful when the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Quoting my son Tim, wholeness is a way to quantify limitlessness. For me, deep design is in repetitive, rhythmic spatial harmonies that parallel those in nature. When they integrate, the painting becomes alive. It is about being in touch with a living presence which unifies my visual perceptions. I will close with a poem from Rilke. I live my life in widening circles that reach out across the world. I may not complete this last one, but I give myself to it.
Thank you, Rita. That was very good. We can next go to John Goodrich. John?
Oh, good. You can hear me now. Okay. Well, thanks, Bob. And I think I may repeat some of what Rita said, but hopefully in a slightly different, from a slightly different point of view. I'm drawn to the theme of deep design because it's clear to me that design is all around us in nature. Things present them to us visually, and there's a certain sense to how they look. We all grow bigger. We grow from a single cell, become a person, or an armadillo, or a housefly, whatever. But we all start as one way and grow according to some intelligent design to become what we are. A tree grows from an acorn, and the trunk divides again. So it's clear there's some kind of overarching design at work. I like what Thomas Aquinas said way back in the mid 13th century. He wrote that we see things which lack knowledge, such as natural bodies, act for an end. It is plain that they achieve their end, not fortuitously, but designedly. And there are obviously patterns in nature, and I think the task of the artist is to remake those patterns in the language of painting, to paint art and life. I don't see abstraction as a kind of advanced form of drawing or painting. I think of it as sort of the beginnings, where we started without quite knowing it. A newborn doesn't recognize things, except possibly a mother's face. Newborn can't tell a wall from a chair, from a sofa, from a curtain. A newborn sees sensations of tones and soon colors and shapes, and learns, possibly the biggest education we all get, learns what things mean, what those visual sensations mean. These two forms together become the corner of a room, a lighter and a darker area, meeting along a vertical line. A series of lights and darks or colors becomes a chair or a person. And we learn all that. We even learn that it changes constantly with your point of view as you're carried about in your parents' arms, and as the light changes. So we learn to recognize things. And this is a fantastic act of construction, really. When you think we can only focus on a tiny part of the world at once, every time we absorb an environment, we're basically constructing it mentally from a whole series of glances. So we learn to see, and that's a wonderful thing because we can operate in the world, but it's not so good for a painter because we want to tell people what it means to see, how you recognize objects in the first place. And it's interesting to me, I read recently that we've taken about 40 million bits of information per second, but we were aware of about 40 of them. And that happens with our vision too. So we actually do a whole lot of sorting without knowing it. The key is to get back to that most elemental part of the sorting and to make sense of it in painting. Painting is not reality. It's flat, fixed, and finite. The object is to try and make live again, to recreate stuff within the language of paint. And because it's flat, fixed, and finite, painting offers new chances. It can give you a sense of interior scale, how each part relates to a whole defined by the frame, how gestures build up momentum, switch, diffuse, become dilute, whatever, and then resolve in details. And that's all possible to do because of the language of painting. It's something you don't see in life per se, unless you're perhaps an artist, but it's something you learn to do as a painter to recreate life in a deeper way in paint. Here's some pictures of Mondrian. Of course, we're all influenced by the masters. This series of works by Mondrian is interesting to me because he's done over a period of years, the drawings in watercolor, early on the painting, what we think is a classic Mondrian later. Even in his early drawings, he's showing you how aware he is of intervals. He has a rectangle. The rectangle provides a chance to make the complete world. In this case, a series of piers receding into the distance, that compacted bit of sky, deep and distant, a real sense of looking down at it. He's managed to convey that just with a few lines on a rectangle. Or the one below, the drawing at bottom left, he introduces an arc. And he pins down the distance with, it looks like flag poles or telephone poles. Something expands out from it, that great arc that gives you that apron of the sand. Comes in with the water at the left. Now it's just this dense series of lines. And he's changed the speed with which your eye absorbs the image, and he's made it lively, giving you a sense of distance and space. When he uses color, as in that watercolor, which was actually done about 10 years earlier, but it shows the same principles at work, he's laid out a powerful composition with lines, but then multiplied it with color. Every decision becomes different. The colors weight each decision, each interval of drawing. I like how the whites in this painting are so different. You have that white house kind of suspended almost like on a tight wire of the fields, different from the whites of the clouds, different from the whites of the distant water. They're all different, and the greens are all different, and each one adds to a certain rhythmic pulse established by the drawing. And so that spreading apron of sand in the drawing becomes a spreading apron of greenery, and the edge of it, the contrast between the two greens has something to say about that, the energy with which it expands. So he's used color and drawing together to animate an image. And then of course you have the classic Mondrian below, and I can't help but read something real into it, the sense of an overhead blue suspended above our point of view, the depth to that lightest area directly below it. It is slightly lighter than the other lights. That interesting inversion of the blue to get into that red and black, almost funneling and then reopening in a different form. And then what could be the ground plane, all it needs is diagonals to truly read as the ground plane of that bottom gray and yellow. So I feel he's animated a rectangle as much as he can with this particular vocabulary, and surprisingly similar to what he did all along with the drawings. And this is a Corot. It's in the St. Louis Art Museum. He was 76 years old, I believe, when he did this. And it could be a Mondrian within a Mondrian within a Mondrian. Wonderfully complex and exciting image for me. The ground plane is compacted. Light beach, shadowed beach, that funny elusive blue-gray for the shadow, luminous blue for the water. So he leads your eye back into space quickly over that steeply, rapidly receding ground plane. The tops of the boats just tease the horizon line. And then you get that tremendous pulling back of the winch at the lower right, releasing the boat. So pulling here, an interval, and then releasing. Wonderfully energetically done. So he's seen the boats in a certain way and caught how he interpreted the boats rhythmically. He's given life to them rhythmically. And the way those distant cliffs, one circumnavigates that foreground vertical of the winch, another one kind of piles above the boat. wonderfully animated for me. When you look at what the verticals do and their figures and parts of the winches and that distant church on the bluff, the figures are moving, so you obviously put them where you wanted them, but there's such wonderful notes that punctuate certain distances. So the circulation among them is really quite remarkable to me. They're mostly small, and yet they take you through this vast distance. So what Crow has done, I think, he's done what Mondrian did all along, but he's done it, of course, a more naturalistic way. But every part of that naturalistic depiction has been rhythmically propelled, if you like. He's given character to objects rhythmically. The character of the objects is the rhythmic character. So he's made everything count in a unique way. So Crow, to me, is a master of deep design in the sense that he saw clearly, found an overarching pattern, and then he recreated it within the language of paint. Yeah, thank you. That's my bit.
Thank you, John. And now we go to Colleen Franca.
Thanks, Bob. And thanks, Rita and John, for your insights. Really, really interesting. So I'm going to skip question 1. I'm going to go start with question 2, which is what's the balance between intuition and structural ideas in my painting? And how does this inform my process? And then I'll go to question number 3. So initially, when I thought about this question of, intuition versus structure, I was separating the two. I was kind of putting them in different boxes, intuitive and then structural. But then I started to really pay attention to and, kind of make notes about how do I actually work every day? I hadn't really examined it in, consciously. So, and what I found was it was really difficult to separate the two. I know that when I start a painting, I'm thinking about things. I'm thinking about the structure. I'm thinking about where things are going to sit on the canvas. What's my focus going to be? I'm looking at spatial relationships, and of course, proportion. Being a naturalistic painter, I'm looking at proportion and drawing. So, I think that these are all things that can be considered somewhat analytical or in the structural realm. So I'm taking in lots of information, making decisions. But it's not then like I say, okay, let me stop now and start being intuitive. It's kind of like it's flowing back and forth. I'm using intuition as I make those decisions as well. So, I'm thinking about what's going to feel right, what's needed, what's not needed. It's kind of a free flowing back and forth, kind of a seesaw of using intuition and thinking about structure. I like what Rita said. She said, I don't think about fractals or things like that when I'm painting. I just paint, right? So I feel like I'm very in tune with that statement. And, but however, when I do step back from my work, I am kind of thinking more about in an analytical way. And I'm really thinking like the analytical critic in me comes out and helps me to make decisions about how to move forward with the painting. So this painting that's being displayed right now is called Summer. And it was painted in Maine from a cabin that I've rented it for like 8 years with my husband. And so this is kind of an annual painting for me. I go back and pay ode to Lois Dodd with my laundry painting. And what I love about the subject is that, the way the light hits the clothes. And typically I'm painting this in the morning. So each year I come back to it. I'm very familiar with it. And I usually zoom right in on the clothes themselves. But last summer I decided to change things up a bit. I painted it later in the day, in the afternoon. So I was actually on the other side of the clothesline. And that opened up my space more. It all of a sudden I'm facing this water and trees as a backdrop. There's an island beyond that. And at a certain point, I felt I needed to ground the composition a little bit. So I dragged that lounge chair over. And the trees became kind of like a scaffold for me, holding up the picture. So I was thinking about structure, but it was really an intuitive process for me. So, and I'm not really confining structure to line and form and space. I'm actually thinking of color as well when I think about structure. So I'm trying to seek a balance between, in a type of unity in my palette. I'm looking for the warm and the cool relationships, the hues and the intensity. And, of course, mixing color can be very formulaic. Some people are very formulated in the way that they mix. But there's still intuition involved, no matter what, as you're kind of mixing these pigments together, you're thinking, you're getting surprises as you go along. So, and I've recently actually begun exploring with using a very limited palette, and just was white, black, ochre, and cadmium red, and which was what a lot of the old masters like Rembrandt used, on their portraits. And I was really amazed that when, limiting yourself, how you can get such a broad palette and mixture of colors out of that limited, selection of colors. So, and the funny thing is that when I restricted myself to those colors, I actually felt very free. Sometimes when I look at my palette and has so many colors on it, I feel like I'm a kid in a candy shop and I don't know where to go next. So this was actually helping me to relate the colors more and be a little bit more controlled. So I guess in conclusion with this question number 2 is I think that for me, a successful working process, it really uses both. It's a free-flowing back and forth intuition combined with elements of good design and structure, which those are the things that are going to help us, kind of point us in a direction and help us make decisions as we're working. So I'm going to go on to the third question now, and I'm going to talk about who I feel embodies this concept of deep design in who I look at a lot. And if you could go to the next slide, John, that would be great. So who I've chosen is, and who I believe embodies this concept of deep design is Piero della Francesca. He speaks to so many artists today, and I wanted to explore some aspects of deep design that he uses and how it relates to what I'm trying to achieve in my paintings. So we do know, those of you who studied Piero and looked at him a lot and maybe read about his history, is we know that he is a mathematician. He knows a lot about perspective and architectural structure. He was fascinated with geometry and mathematics, and you really feel that when you look at the work. You look at the construction of his compositions, and you can see very clearly how he's divided the spaces and has used geometric composition to solidify what he's painting. But he also has this ability to make everything look so very believable and as they exist in space. So I think, as I'm looking at this, when I go out landscape painting, I actually tend to avoid architecture and structure, any kind of geometric form. I love to paint trees and skies and open areas, anything that's growing and is organic. But I do want my paintings to achieve a naturalistic sense of being believable and concerned with, I am concerned with creating an overall structure. One of my problems actually is that I don't follow rules very well. So I realized that, Piero is probably everything that I am not. I mean, he is very, he's very based in this design, thinking in this design way. So I keep looking at the structural connections in his work. And, but what's interesting to me is that he's making use of not just architectural, forms, but organic forms. So, and I also see him breaking the rules sometimes, which I felt very good about. The rebel in me kind of like that, because, like, for example, in this painting in the Resurrection, which is in San Sepolcro, there are actually 2 vanishing points, right? So if we see the faces of the soldiers from below, right? But we also see the face of Christ. He's, kind of dead center. So we're looking straight at him. And so I think there he sacrificed this rule of, looking at everything from one point perspective for the sake of composition and effect in his work. So, I think he's strong enough in his concepts of design that he's able to really circumvent the rules if if the painting needs it. So the painting is divided into 3 horizontal bands, right? Christ is occupying the middle band with his head and shoulders reaching the upper band of the sky. So his figure kind of unites the earth and the heavens, right? And the guards are in the zone below the line marked by his foot on that wall. And the central vertical actually divides the scene with winter on the left with that tree with the bare branches, and summer on the right where the branches are flourishing with greens. So there's a lot of repetitive patterns in his work, such as the helmet in the soldier, of the soldier. It's echoing those hills behind him. If you look at the ripple of Christ's flesh and his abdomen, those are mimicking the clouds beyond in the sky. The reclining soldier is really interesting on the bottom right, because you really couldn't ever achieve that natural pose if you were actually sleeping on something. It's just kind of awkward and unbelievable. But it looks believable, but you couldn't really sleep like that in real life. His comrade on the left is actually, he doesn't have legs, you know, you can't even find his legs. So I think that in looking at that, it's like Piero was really thinking more about composition and geometry and kind of letting things, you know, be what they are, not having to have the drawing exactly so that you see where everything is. So I think I'm very interested in these deep design decisions Piero is making. And I think the reason I'm drawn to him, though, so strongly is more about how he captures this quiet mystery in these monumental figures in his works. And these monumental figures are powerfully expressing the human experience, right? Eli Siegel, who was a poet and critic, said of Piero, and I think this is very interesting, he said, Piero put together geometry and emotion. And this is what we want. We want this feeling that our blood cells have something to do with eternal forms. If we could only relate our palpitating worries, our fearful bodies to something as eternal as triangles and spheres, that would be a comfort. So thank you. That's my talk.
Thank you, Colleen. Next, we go to Martha Armstrong. Martha?
Thank you, Bob. I've learned so much hearing these stories again and again. Every time I learn something new. I'm going to go back to something that happened to me when I first started thinking of myself as a painter. I was studying a lot of art history, but no one was really answering the question of what is abstract painting. And I spent an enormous amount of time on my own trying to figure out Mondrian and Kandinsky through things they had written, but also many other painters too. As a young painter, it was a mystery how they got to where they did. I also was taking a zoology course, having never seen the ocean. And outside the lecture hall, there was a light box with a live horseshoe crab in it, which I had never seen a horseshoe crab before. And it was a complete mystery. And the ocean became a complete mystery for me. I had grown up on inland lakes, which you can see all the way around. The water tastes a little bit like what comes out of a tap, rather brackish, but not what I encountered when I first went to the ocean. And my first experience was with a 3-year-old who had to get in the water much faster than I did. And she scampered over wet stones that were covered with barnacles. And anyone who has encountered barnacles knows that they're razor sharp. And I soon realized I'm clutching them with all my might, and my feet are bleeding all over the place. This child jumps in the water, so of course I jump in after her. And the water tastes very much like blood, which I thought, this is just shocking to me. And fortunately, I could hang on to her. She did not drown. And I've learned later that the salt content of the ocean is very similar to the salt content of blood. So it wasn't a completely mistaken correlation. But when I finally got to the ocean on my own and got a chance to look at it and try to paint it, I would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and go and just draw and draw and draw and draw as I was taught by Leonard Baskin, without props. Don't put in clouds, don't put in waves, don't put in boats, don't put in rocks. Draw the ocean. And I found this, I could not arrive at anything satisfactory. I took many of my drawings home to Philadelphia, and I remember sitting there on the sofa in the living room with a drawing pad saying, now, okay, draw the ocean. And I said, well, the most prominent thing is a horizon line. So I put the horizon line in and realized it looked like a Kleenex box. That didn't work. So I started by identifying the land under my feet and over my head. And then I had to connect them with verticals down the front of the drawing, and that looked like a prison. So that didn't work. So I decided I'd break the line. So I broke the line at the bottom, broke the line at the top, and connected it with a broken line. And then I went out a little farther and made a broken line across the first several feet away from me and overhead, the first feet over my head, and connected that with a broken line, and on till I met that horizon line without actually drawing it. And I realized I had all these little plus and minus signs. I had verticals and horizontals. And then I realized it's not a rectangle. I have to draw a line around it and make it round. The space looks round as all those little crosses clustered in toward the horizon line. And then I thought, my gosh, it looks exactly like a Mondrian, which was, again, shocking to me. I realized that Mondrian had gone to Paris in the early 1900s and seen Cubism. He came back to the Netherlands and got trapped in the Netherlands during World War I. Just about the time he did those drawings that John Goodrich showed. And he did a lot of drawings starting with the ocean, which really appears to everyone in the Netherlands. You're never far from the ocean, from the North Sea. And he ended up doing a very significant series of works called Pier and Ocean, which I suddenly saw on my own drawing. I don't know if that's exactly how Mondrian got there, but he was already thinking about this. I found a quote saying, imagine a painting of vertical and horizontal lines with curves, calculated by intuition, could be a work of art, strong and true, which he must have written before he did these paintings. He anticipated what he was going to do. And it makes complete sense. They're so significant for that time because we were dealing with Freud and the unconscious and realizing that the conscious mind is only a fraction of what we're aware of. We were dealing with outer space and we were measuring it in light years, which are not a visible thing. They're a concept of space, a concept of measurement. And on till we have ultrasounds and all kinds of other ways of seeing that are not visual, that are not coming from our eyes. And yet I'm very interested in what Rita's talking about, in fractals being something about the way our eye works, going from one point in a painting we're looking at to another, and one point to another in what we're working on ourselves. And I think Jackson Pollock was one of the examples used, but why wouldn't it work also for Titian or Monet or Rembrandt? Why wouldn't it work for painting that is designed by a human mind that has this sense of order in it, which we experience every day from the time we open our eyes? We experience fractals in nature, in all of our seeing. Dutch painting always had done something similar in using perspective, that you look at Hobbema or you look at Ruysdael and you see that plane of the ground and the plane over your head and the way they reflect each other, match each other, but not quite. And it is very interesting that in a sense, Mondrian's doing the same thing, but he's not doing it through a representation. He's not doing it through some mimicking natural things. He's doing it through an invention of an equivalent. He's doing it through a translation of space into a form for a painting. And that, to me, is what deep design means, is that kind of translation of what you're looking at into a painterly form. And I think we're all doing that, and some using visual material more significantly, but the 20th century is full of all kinds of invented ideas of painting, Cubism, for example, one of the most significant. So I wanted to show you a couple of paintings that I did this summer. So when I just went and plopped down in the sand and tried to paint the ocean, not so much imitating everything I'm looking at, but to try to translate it into a painterly form. And Mon went back to his studio and became more and more abstract. And it was a reasonable direction, because direction, probably why he is such a famous artist today. And I went back to looking at the landscape, which was certainly retrograde in relation to that. But I love to look at things, and it's not going to, every painter makes up his or her own rules for painting. The longer you paint, the more you're making up those rules. There's that story of Cezanne being out painting and throwing his paintings into a bush saying, these are not what I want. These are not my paintings. Or Picasso being accosted by someone who said, is this your painting? And he said, no, it's a fake. I said, I saw you painting this when I was in your studio. And he said, I paint lots of fakes. And I think that we've all had that experience too. I find that that experience of encountering Mondrian the way I did is something he did. I could not follow him. It was his decision to become more and more abstract. But next painting, please. I had to simply invent from what I was looking at, and that's the way I work, although I have tremendous respect for abstract painting. In fact, I find it rather interesting that we still argue about the morality of abstract painting versus representational painting. And it shows up in religion, it shows up in the Ten Commandments, it shows up in Islamic art that had an injunction against representation for centuries. And I think it's kind of interesting that we still have this conflict over abstraction and representation, which has nothing to do with the subject that we're talking about. So if I went on to the third question about who I look at, I say I look at Manet as much as anyone. I feel very close to Manet because he didn't settle on any one way of working. And he said, painting is like jumping off into the water and having to learn how to swim all over again every time you pick up a brush. And I find that's very true. And that's why I put the Diebenkorn quote in my statement that Diebenkorn said, I'd like to get as far away from home base as I can every time I start to work. And it's trying to get away from habits. It's trying to get away from seeing something the way you've seen it before. What does it look like today? To be as fresh about that as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. And now to Janet Gorzeño.
The question I'm responding to is, what does deep design mean to me? I felt an immediate affinity with the phrase deep design when it was suggested as the theme for this Bowery project. For me, deep design resonates on many levels. When used as a formal concept, it can refer to a drawing or painting's essential linear structure or armature, which is often geometrically designed. Works by Renaissance painter and mathematician Piero della Francesca are magnificent examples of geometry-infused composition. We saw Piero's painting The Resurrection earlier this evening as part of Colleen's talk. In The Resurrection and other works by Piero, dynamic symmetry functions to activate two-dimensional planar tensions and to bring to the pictorial subject visual continuity, rhythm, balance, and flow. A profound stillness emanates from Piero's work as art and geometry become one. It is this sense of stillness emanating from the ordering powers of geometry that is for me the most compelling aspect of deep design and offers further connotations for the phrase. While deep design may be the formal structure of the work, it can also refer to a kind of visual arrangement or pattern that provokes visual associations with the unconscious or meditative states. Here, I think of sacred art forms, such as Tonka painting, or even some tantric imagery and Byzantine icon painting. I thought of icon painting actually when we were looking at Piero's Resurrection, where the compositional frontality and centrality of the Christ figure generates a sense of timelessness. The patterns of sacred art, usually in tandem with finely tuned color structures, can have a transformational effect on the viewer. The viewer is somehow changed in the act of perceiving the work, and sometimes in a way that surpasses rational understanding. And I think the geometry is key to this. When the deepest layers in a work of art operate with integrity, as geometry demands, subsequent layers are likewise charged. In my own paintings in gouache on paper, heads in profile don mysterious hats or headdress, supported by underlying geometry. I love composing in the square, but I don't make composition fit geometry. I discover it in the process of working. I begin my paintings with broad strokes, guided by the tactile sensation of the brush as it marks, slides, blends, and slurs across a painterly surface. While I work, faces will emerge, often to dissolve again. As I slowly develop a picture, I remain aware of the structural forces in the format, but I am equally guided by subconscious impulse, memory, and imagination. In addition to underlying structure, my paintings also offer overt references to geometry in the form of concrete shape patterns. I see these patterns like jewels or gateways to a different kind of picture space. In my work, I seek equilibrium between vivid abstraction and representation. A passage that I find inspiring, written by iconographer Father Siluan Justiniano, talks about the sacred art of icon painting and may have relevance here. He writes, "There are two extreme poles in icon painting. On the one hand, abstraction, autonomy. On the other hand, naturalism, illusionism. Either extreme will tend to shatter iconicity if they occupy a central place. The first forsakes nature in search for things intelligible. The second overemphasizes sensation." I see this dynamic clearly in Byzantine icons, but also in frescoes by Giotto, and even in certain paintings by Matisse, who was apparently interested in icons. Deep design alludes to the essential order, underlying structure, or geometry of a work. But for me, it also refers to the compositional forces that substantiate and engage the human spirit. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. And now Janet will take over moderating the question and answer period.
And so if there's a question, please feel free to write it in the chat or just shout, raise your hand and we'll call on you. And don't forget to unmute.
Should I begin?
You're welcome to begin, Barbara. Hi.
Hi, everybody. First of all, I think you've all been very interesting and really quite terrific. And I'm going to borrow the idea of a quote and address my question from this quote. And it's a brand new quote that I read the other day from a contemporary composer musician named Tyshawn Sorry. He said, "I want to start from a place where the lines between notated and improvised music have disappeared completely. And that brings to mind what I'm getting at, which is the wonderful introductions you've had and the images you've presented. And I think what most of you have been talking about is the segue between the intellectual and the passion you have for the intuitive. You know, I mean, that seems to be a commonality here. So the question I have is, how do you talk or define that place, that moment when the two come together seamlessly in your work? You know, is that when the work reaches its apex, or when it becomes an entity in itself, when it becomes ART? You know, how do you know? Where is that place? I mean, we seem to all share that, but how do you know? And when is that?
That's a great question. Does anyone want to take that? Are you directing that to anyone in the show? Maybe the whole show. Yeah, because we have people here not necessarily in the panel that were in the show.
Yeah, and yes, please.
Yeah.
I think it's not an easy question. I admit that.
Okay,
Rita?
okay, I think I'll answer that actually, two ways. One is, I think when I was talking about essences, there comes moments when intuition or improvisation in that moment feels totally and completely right. It may not be, but I think it feels right and probably is right. I assume when you're playing an instrument, that kind of thing happens too. So it's partly in your act. When I was I'm going to answer it now with another question. So when I was in college and I knew nothing, and kids had gone to music and art and they knew a whole lot, and I would keep asking, how do you know a painting is done? And they would say, you just know. And I would go, oh, yeah, I don't know. What's wrong with me? So I think that part of it is an intuitive knowing that's really deep, that you can't answer that question.
And what does it look like? How do you make that segue from the intellectual, which everybody here participates in, and then that intuition? How do you know that? I mean, if it's a representational piece, how does that work with the intuitive? If it's a non-objective piece, how does that work?
So for me, it works because I feel it when I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes, nature becomes me, I become nature, and it's just this wonderful feeling.
That's very interesting. Yeah. Anybody else have a thought about it? Because you all seem to share that.
Well, I think for me, the intellect always gets in the way.
What gets in the way?
The intellect does. They actually are opposite poles, and
Yeah.
the intuition has to work, or the painting doesn't work. And I think the hardest thing is I don't really know at the time. I have to look at it again the next day. So that's really the heartache of painting, is you don't know what you're doing until you have a little distance from it.
Yeah.
And it seems, for me, it takes a day or two. I have to look at it later, just produce it and then not judge, come back a day later.
Has anybody had this experience that, as John is saying, and I think this is very, very true for many of us, that if you come back the next day and you can't enter the painting, then it's telling you something? You can't go in there and fiddle or change, that it's an entity. Hi, Deborah. That, that you can't reconfigure it anymore. That's it.
Maybe telling you something scary. Like, abandon hope, all ye who enter here.
Well, that's a worst case scenario, yeah.
Well, it's on the spectrum.
Well,
I mean, I think it is. I mean, I think it goes from there to it's maybe as done as you can do at the time. I mean,
Martha and Colleen, I think I saw your hands go up. One person in the
I mean, I don't throw things out. I mean, it's a very, very bad habit, but I can come back to a painting that I'd been disgusted with and abandoned a year ago and bring it back and think, oh, there's some, and find, I'll just take it a completely new direction. And that's, I think I'm never sure. As long as it's in my studio, I'm going to work on it, you know. I mean, I'll see something different in it every time I walk into the studio. I don't think, sometimes I've finished something and I'm halfway down the stairs before I realize, I guess I'm finished with that. I mean, I've stopped painting it and have decided that it's finished at some level, but it's not necessarily a conscious decision. And going back to the idea of, are you using intellect or intuition? I just think it's a constant back and forth process. You're using one and then you're using the other. You're using one and you're using the other. I don't think there's any clear division there, but I think everybody makes up their own rules. You know, it's taken me, I don't know how many years to make up my own rules, but I think you make up your own rules about painting. That's why, you know, when you're young, you look at this painter and you look at that painter and you think, well, this is terrific. And I just gave something to someone to write an essay, and they said, oh, this is your homage to Matisse. And I said, well, that was in the 70s, you know, that was a long time ago. But I don't think I do that anymore, you know, do an homage to someone. I was just out of art school, you know, I'm just, you make up your own rules and you tend to stick with them, even after I've said those things about Diebenkorn. I try to get as far away from home base as myself as possible, no preconceived ideas. And it's in a way, it's a fantasy. It's the hardest thing in the world to get away from yourself.
Colleen?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that, you know, when you sometimes pass by a mirror and you see your face and you're like, oh my God, you know, you're like, there's sort of this, like, there's something wrong there. That's me, you know, like you don't recognize it. To me, looking at a painting that doesn't work is kind of like that. Like you just kind of, it's in your gut. You'll look at it and say, there's something wrong here. This just doesn't look good. So when I feel like you can look at a work and say, you know, that's not half bad, and it doesn't really need anything, and it's almost like a feeling of, I don't want to say boredom, but it's like I'm done with it. I've kind of done everything I can do. You know, maybe I'll start a new painting with the same motif or whatever, but it's kind of like I can move on. You know, I can move on from there. That's the way I experience it anyway.
I'm trying to look hard to see who might be.
I haven't seen anybody else with a question. Or
I think it's also fine to just speak, because what happens then is the little green box comes up and it's easy to see that. But we have Dina. Dina made a comment. May I read your comment, Dina? I love what Martha said. It's really hard to get away from yourself. That's good.
May I ask the question?
Absolutely.
For me, it's going to nature is when you know that these patterns and these systems operate behind them. They're a human construct, but we can find them in nature. It's a certain comfort in knowing that they're there. And if you plunge in and just start working with what you're seeing, that you can find them. You can bring them to you can impress them into your service. You can put them to your use. So I find just in a certain sense, it allows me to use my whole education in science to just to give me the confidence and the courage to go forward with making art. So, that wasn't the question. Anybody feel the same way?
yeah, I do. I think that's what I was trying to say a little bit, that I see congruencies between things I've learned in science and in my process in art. And it adds to the whole sense that something's right about this, that there is a design in nature that I can look for in art. That's my language. My language is color and shape and form, but I can also see it in other languages. I can see it in the equations. They're different languages, so they emphasize different aspects of what we're looking for. But that adds to it. It makes a bigger whole.
Anne just posted in the chat a good question I think that almost anyone in the show could take. Does anyone want to speak to geometric form and or organic form being an organizing principle?
Well, I'll talk about that.
Okay.
Sorry. Visual experience is so complex because you're not seeing a diagram of nature. You're seeing nature from a certain point of view under a certain light. And all those make it even more complex. And so I think the connections are intuitive. So, you know, a tree has a certain height. It's got there by growing in a certain way according to its own internal laws or laws of nature. And a painting will reflect that. It rises above the horizon to a certain point. But I do think in the end, it's so complicated and that you can't understand it logically, but you can make it have its own, I guess, intuitive logic on a canvas by building that world on a canvas, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so for me, it goes past that though. It's always changing. Everything is always changing. The light changes on an object, and forms change constantly. So I see the geometry as being much more organic and about change and complexity rather than Euclidean geometry that we've used in the past to make constructions.
Can I say something?
Yeah.
There's been talk about abstraction and you know, it's opposite, as it were, working from life. Paul Klee, who I think is one of the really truly great abstractionists, said that the visible, what's immediately in front of you, is one example or one possibility among others. And I think the world that an abstractionist, and I'm an abstractionist, looks at is the same world that a figurative painter looks at, but for different things. For an abstractionist, the world is a world of forces as well as objects, or forces instead of objects. And the view from here, the distance between what is here, the painter, and what is there on the canvas is there's no measurable distance. So the sort of pathways that you find in a marvelous Corot, for instance, are negated in the Mondrian. And actually, John, the drawings that you show are showing Mondrian on his way to tilting everything up into the picture plane. In fact, he's got practically no sky, and he's got things standing up like this, actually. And it's a second from there to the Pierian Ocean, which is a way of imagining an immeasurable space, the ocean, making a kind of closure on it. The oval that he makes is a kind of closure that challenges, you know, that puts it in tension with the idea that the innumerable repetition of lapping waves cannot be translated into a painting except by the idea of a sort of infinitely extensible sort of network of lines, which is what he derives from the Cubist paintings. But I think the idea that there isn't the idea that there's no distance between the viewer for an abstract painting is no longer a spectator in a certain sense, because there's no measurable distance, and that's what connects 20th century abstraction so much to Byzantine art, for instance, because the idea of the action of the painting coming out this way, the idea of immanence or frontality, is an idea that's very different from the idea of perspective, which invites you back into a space where you're seeing a stage set and you're a spectator who experiences a space that's similar, that's a simulacrum of the deep space that you're in. Abstraction is not necessarily reduction by any means, and fractals, for instance, are a way of extending measure so that you would end up with, instead of a contour that's 6 inches long, you would end up with a contour that's 18 inches long because the gauge of measurement is that much finer. And the same thing happens with topological structures, rubber band space, or what's it called, rubber sheet space, which is different from the Euclid, as Rita said, it's different from Euclidean geometry. And it's a geometry of movement and curvature rather than a geometry of solid, the Platonic solids.
Well, could I just address that? For me, I see Crowe's paintings and his drawings and Rembrandt's drawing as being abstract. I mean, someone who understands that drawing is an abstract endeavor. It's on paper, it's not reality. And so they're aware of what a flat shape is and how it is simultaneously a flat shape with a certain energy and a movement in space. So I don't view, well, every artwork to me is abstract. Some is more representational, but the best representational works draw on the abstract qualities. So I don't, for me, this isn't that dichotomy between the abstract and the representational. It's all there, apparent, working together all the time.
Yeah, it's kind of a
But it's a very different impulse to want to stand in front of a motif and actually translate that into a painting from starting from mathematical schemata or things that you see under the idea of a division into thirds or something like that. It's a very different impulse. What you're calling abstraction, I would say, is every painting has structure that has to do with planar geometry because you're working on a rectangle. I agree with that. You can't gainsay that. But we're seeing a landscape here. Wow. I mean, I don't know what it means to say that Corot is abstract if you're going to look at Mondrian or if you're going to look at Kandinsky. I mean, there's different pressures. There are different ways of looking at the world. No, I mean,
can I respond to that?
There is a,
Respond to that?
oh, go ahead,
Here's
Martha.
Martha, you want to go first?
Let me just respond to what
Yes,
Deborah's
please, go
saying.
ahead.
I think it's very fascinating how differently individual painters respond to the world, just as you're talking about. It reminds me of the story that Leland Bell used to talk about Mondrian, that, and I've heard this secondhand if somebody wants to correct it. When Mondrian was in New York, apparently there was a great tea party given for him at a apartment that overlooked Central Park. And they gave him the seat of honor that he could look over Central Park and enjoy the view. And Leland Bell said he got more and more agitated as he sat there. And finally he got up and said, "Please change places with me. I can't stand looking at all that green." And I think he was much more turned on about to work with something in his mind to order the painting that he wanted to do. And for somebody who works from looking is almost compulsive. I mean, to look at things is is the most exciting thing in the world. So that's where you start.
Anne has a question in the chat, but Anne, I'm not sure. Can you clarify it if you're there hearing this? Yeah, you're here on the call.
Yeah.
Okay.
What did I say? I said something. Deborah was speaking about entering the paint
Perspective.
through perspective, like the window idea, and then also talking about the icon. And I was wondering if the panel, anybody on the panel wants to speak to a painting trying to do both in one painting.
Yeah.
Let's hold on to that question. I think Monica had wanted to say something about what Martha was saying. Do you want to, Mark?
Yes, I did. I just, as someone who was working both quote unquote abstractly as well as I've worked from observation, but more recently in my painting, I'm working both from memory of observation rather than actually standing in front of something. So I'm looking at something very intensely, going back into the studio and thinking about having digested it in a certain way. So it's not necessarily a plein air kind of experience, but it's my reaction to whatever my has resided in my mind's eye. But I also work completely abstractly without any references to objects, necessarily recognizable objects. And it's the same feeling for me of basically absorbing what my vision, what has impacted my vision. And in that, there is a kind of a residue of geometric experience of what I see as a kind of order in the perhaps chaotic experience of perception, so that it comes back to me as something that I have, it's gone through my filter, so to speak. So I just wanted to address that business about Mondrian as an abstract, as his abstract painting versus his observed paintings, because I can very much feel both sides of that coin.
May I speak? I don't know.
Yes, Barbara, please. And we still have a question on the floor from Anne too, but go ahead, Barbara.
I think that I would agree very much with John in that everything is pretty much abstract. And the fact that everybody who gave their talked about passions that they had beyond the moment when they were actually either looking at something or inventing, because both things were going on. And they're all abstract concepts that they are underlying, and their passions, yet you might be looking at a plein air situation and those abstractions are still underlying them. So I don't think they can be separated, is my point.
I agree.
Yeah, I think I agree too.
Well,
I would say that what you're talking about in a certain sense is the design aspect of painting, which is how it sort of maps out on the flat surface of the rectangle. I was trying to talk about a kind of impulse, a kind of temperament, actually. And I do think I do think that Mondrian's temperament is different from Corot's temperament. I adore both of them, but I think it's worth recognizing who each one is. And Paul Klee is a great figure painter, as far as I'm concerned. And my paintings are full of figures and things like that. I don't think abstraction is the absence of a subject or the absence of the object even. I think it's a way of, it's a temperamental difference. It's a that has to do with where you want to go into things, how you want to engage. Clay said something about, I can't remember the phrase exactly, something about not facing the green present, being, and for me, that's the idea of the world of forces, some of which are unseen but felt. And it led to these painters thinking about the view under the microscope, through the telescope, the aerial view, which had never been seen by human beings before people went up in airplanes, and so on and so forth. And those things do make a difference, I think, and do, I mean, I adore Corot, but I mean, I think understanding what we're talking about in part is a temperamental thing. And Mondrian did not do those drawings and those paintings at the same time as the classic fully abstract ones, by the way.
Oh, if I could
Rita?
just say something. Oh,
Go ahead, John, you can go first. I was going to sum it up with something, but go ahead.
Okay, but there's different approaches to abstraction too. I mean, I find Barnett Newman to denote sublimity, while Mondrian lives it. I think Mondrian draws from all of visual life, even in those abstractions, while Barnett Newman is within his own idea of what art can do and what abstraction is for. So there's all kinds of abstraction out there, but I like abstraction that derives from life, which Mondrian does for me.
Okay, so Deborah, I love Paul Klee a whole lot. I think he's absolutely wonderful. And in his treatise on modern art, he had a metaphor which I think fits what we're all saying. I'm going to paraphrase it because I can't remember exactly, the words. He said, art is like a tree. The roots are from nature. The artist is the trunk, and the branches are the art. The art may not necessarily look like the roots, but it comes from them. And I think that's a really wonderful way to kind of balance out this continuum of abstraction and looking at looking at nature.
Yeah.
You want to go on to the next question?
I am looking to see if any hands are up, but I don't see any. There was the question that Anne posed. And if you're still there, do you want to ask that again? Anne?
Okay. It was back to Deborah's comment talking about perspectival view versus the iconic frontal entrance into a painting. And I wondered if anybody, if people were striving to do both in one painting, aspects of both in one painting.
There's some famous examples of Klee doing it, by the way, where he does perspective of a room with occupants. It's one of a small series of paintings where he takes the perspective orthogonals and he puts them all the way up so that, and then he does it as a transfer print so that there are marks and marks, I don't know how else to describe it, that float onto the surface. So you're feeling the surface as well as the incursion into depth at the same time, so that it's both flat and perspectively deep. It's a great trick. I mean, they're fabulous paintings.
I mean, thank you for that. I think I asked because it feels like that is an aspect of contemporary art, trying to do both.
Yeah. I mean, I'm thinking of Diebenkorn, right? And how he's always looking at perspective and the figures in his work, even when he goes beyond using figures into abstraction. I think there's both going on as well, as Deborah described with Paul Klee. I think he's, starting from a certain vantage point, and that's definitely expressed in the work. But you know, he's not exactly. It's not all about just perspective. There is, you know, this kind of frontality and this, you know, centrality and iconography. Really, if you look at his work, it looks like iconography and geometry in his work. So I think there's a lot of, you know, I don't necessarily think they're in opposition to one another. I think a lot of painters are actually exploring that at the same time. You know, they're not necessarily one or the other. And what do you think? I mean, you deal with a lot of, I know that you draw in space a lot. And so is that why you asked the question, or was that?
Yeah. Yes. I'm just always personally battling that. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and artists have done it from all time, obviously, because shapes
Right.
and, you know, negative shape and all that have always been important to constructing a painting. So it's just my approach. I'm just always struggling. Deborah talked about it as temperament, which is kind of helpful. I think about it as approach. I'm always just wondering, you know, forget subject matter, just go for the feeling and the form and some sort of, yeah. So I'm just always, it's always a question for me.
Yeah, no, I struggle with it as well. So
Well,
gotcha.
and perspective is a convention. It's a technique. There are great paintings before perspective. I mean, Giotto was a tremendous gravity of gesture and very meaningful and human and all that, but it's not done with in regards to perspective. So I think perspective's kind of overrated in that respect. It's not reality. It's just one conventional organizing.
Right. Right. Image making or
well, along with
naturalism, whatever.
Yeah, along with modeling, realistic modeling of forms, it's something an academic painter learns, and it's useful, and we're used to it. And when you look at it, we say, oh, okay, now I know the space. But there's a different kind of space, I think, in a Giotto, which is more of emotional, intuitive space, has to do with the rhythm of forms. And it does give, you know, that gravity of form arises from that. I can think of lots of academic painters who don't get that gravity of form.
Right.
There is a pre-Alberti, kind of perspective in those paintings. But yeah, I mean, perspective is definitely an artificial construct. And one point perspective, as it was really put together by Uccello and others, was used for a very short period of time, basically. Not worth the effort, perhaps.
Yeah, I don't think they had as much information as they do now. So they were dealing with what they, you know, it was kind of new, right? And they were dealing with that, and life moved on.
But what is real? I mean, Giotto is real in a way that an academic painter isn't. So I hate to think, you know, we're more advanced, we know better. Who paints like Giotto now? Who could? But so perspective is one bump along the way, which created, I think, a kind of superficial version of reality, but not a deeper one. In my opinion.
Good point.
Although perspective is kind of the ultimate mathematical construct. You know, I mean, it was a useful construct, you know, for the Greeks, and then it became a useful construct for, you know, the Renaissance painters. So like you said, it really is just one way of presenting space.
Right.
Yeah.
And you do a bad painting,
A
great painting.
greater painter uses it in a greater way. I mean, that's all.
Yeah.
I mean,
It isn't it. I'm not a perspective painter, but isn't perspective based on keeping your eye kind of still and focusing on one point? And if that's true, it really goes against what we now know about how we see and how we organize things by moving our eyes around.
but
Well,
that's
only
but it is an artificial construct that's supposed to that builds paintings that aren't painted directly from life. Those aren't perceptual paintings.
No, that's true.
I mean, you're a post-impressionist painter.
Also, during the Renaissance, perspective was used essentially to guide you towards God, in a sense, in the painted
One God.
city. So perspective had a purpose during the Renaissance to in terms of the message.
Hmm.
Okay.
There's an
Anybody?
interesting painter, Maria Elena Vieira de Silva, who died in, I guess, the 80s, 70s, lived in Paris, whose sort of semi-abstract paintings use perspective over and over. And she's worth looking at. There was a recent show in New York. There hasn't been a show in many years.
These are 3 trees by Monica Bernier. This is Esme Thompson. Martha Armstrong again, we recognize that from the talk. And this is my work, which has nothing to do with the picture plane.
Fitting, isn't it?
Yet it's
I love it.
really appropriate. Next,
Well, it's called
Adrienne Lobel's work. Colleen Franca's. Iris Osterman. Water is a great subject in this topic. John Goodrich. Janet Gorzeno. Najib Nahas. It's really tiny.
Yeah.
And I think we missed, I think Dorothy Frey's work went by rather fast. They're kind of in the order that they are on the wall. If you see the exhibit, they're in the sequence. There we go, Dorothy's work. You know, we all treat, I mean, if you talk about structure in nature, you know, we owe a great debt to trees.
And water.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.
It was great. Thank you so much.